I wanted to talk about a big leak from Viktor Orban concerning Donald Trump's plan in order to try to resolve the war in Ukraine, resolve on whose terms as we're about to discuss. But I wanted to show you guys, before they had like some meeting and they sat down and talked all this stuff in private, Donald Trump had like an open party with Viktor Orban and a bunch of other people, and he honored him. He honored him in front of a crowd of his supporters with a backup band with guitars and pianos. They're just having a grand old time. And he said about Viktor Orban, there's nobody that's better, smarter, or a better leader than Viktor Orban. This is the way it's gonna be. And that's the end of it. He's the boss. Listen.
There's nobody that's better, smarter, or a better leader than Viktor Orban. He's fantastic. As you know, the Prime Minister of Hungary, and does a great job. He's a non-controversial figure because he said this is the way it's going to be, and that's the end of it, right? He's the boss. And you know, he's a great leader, fantastic leader in Europe and all over the world.
You know, what I've always found fascinating about, because he's not the first person to, you know, engage in this love affair in the American right with Viktor Orban. I've seen Tucker Carlson craft, let's just say, interesting Fox News documentaries about the glory of Viktor Orban. I've seen many people on the far right and the norm and even moderate right kind of engage in this ooh la la, fluttery eyelashes behavior towards Viktor Orban. And I find it strange. I mean, I don't find it strange, but I do find it horribly hypocritical. Because if I listen to the big stories that I've been hammered over the head by the American right, by Donald Trump, by the MAGA movement, it's we hate corruption. We hate the swamp. We don't like it when people gouge off the state or use it to gouge off of lobbyists or use it to enrich themselves and steal from the American people. And when this is discussed, they're usually not talking literal, as in taking money out of the accounts, putting it into its pockets, or people taking positions and giving it to shell companies. They're usually talking about either donations from lobbyists leading to different people favoring those companies and government contracts, or that they serve those companies' interests on legislation and then afterwards end up working as lobbyists. This is usually what they're talking about. But in Hungary, the corruption is, I mean, this is not that this never exists in the United States as well, but this is a lot more prevalent and a lot more direct, and that is public sector corruption. Within the EU, Hungary has more public sector corruption than any other country. They have so much public sector corruption that it's become a joke in the diplomatic community, to the point where diplomats, I remember seeing the American diplomat go to the location of a project that was where they used EU funds to fund construction amongst this, what was supposed to be this beautiful walkway park. And you go, and it's this barren, like, it looks like plywood bridge across a barren a field that looked like it had been salted by like raiders on horseback, let alone a beautiful, prosperous forest. And the American diplomat went there and took pictures as if it was a normal tourist attraction. And a lot of people were reacting to it like, why is he standing next to this barren, sad, gross bridge? Why is he standing next? Oh, did somebody just post it in chat? You know what? I'll bring it up. It's only fair that I bring up the image. It's only fair. It's only fair that I bring it up. But people were looking at this American diplomat like, why is he sitting next to this barren, sad bridge? And the reason why is he was mocking it. He was mocking Hungarian corruption. He was mocking the fact that despite the fact that Hungary is heavily reliant, here's the I'm sorry, dog. Whoa, look at this beautiful nature reserve. Whoa. Oh, who doesn't want to go to Hungary to check this out? It's so beautiful. This is what EU funds are needed for. This is totally not corruption. This is just dude, why go to Montana? Why go see the Grand Canyon or Niagara Falls when you can come to the Hungarian bridge the Hungarian field bridge. I gotta say, what's the kicker about this for me is the watchtower that makes it give like low-key prison vibes. Like I'm looking for this picture to see like a chain line, like a chain gang of like 30 prisoners digging in the field like it's goddamn, like it's that Disney movie Holes. It's you look, if you make this just like slightly add a little bit more sand, it looks like holes. Okay, point is, this is a travesty, and the watchtower really does make it look like prison. This is a travesty. And so American diplomats came over here, took pictures with it, posted on social media to mock it, because Hungarian public sector corruption is so notorious. And it's not only notorious for the Hungarians, it's bad also for the EU, because EU money going into Hungary when there's other nations that desperately need that investment, and then to just see that money spent on projects like this, I mean, that's a travesty. That's burning up the money. And so now when you start thinking about, oh, why is all of these EU funds frozen from going to Hungary? Why is Hungary fighting tooth and nail and holding everything hostage in order to try to get those funds unfrozen? This is why they're frozen. It's stuff like this that leads to the money being frozen. And Hungary, instead of instituting all of the reforms that would be necessary to get rid of the corruption that Viktor Orban bases much of his power base in, it's just much simpler to hold something else hostage and get the money anyway, so they can all continue to bathe in these types of projects. This was funded by EU money, by the way, so Brussels did this for the Hungarian people. So because of my knowledge of Hungarian corruption, and this is only just one issue. We could go down the line. We could talk about Hungarian issues with the government going after the press and the centralization of the press around Viktor Orban and the Fidesz party, his political party. We could go down the line about around Viktor Orban and his policies and his beliefs, and how it doesn't make sense for people who have been going on an anti-corruption crusade to be so happy with this guy, especially when they're talking about the 2% NATO funding. Where's Hungary's 2%? Hungary doesn't spend 2% on the military. Why isn't he complaining about that? I thought this was his big issue, that Trump was really hard on all the countries that didn't pay 2%. But then when the country's just like, when the country's leader is on your side in the culture war, all of that like fades away. It doesn't matter anymore. It's like a Mark Rutte, the Dutch prime minister. He didn't pay the 2% for 13 years. During Trump's presidency too, but because he knew how to soothe Trump's feelings, Mark Rutte was liked by Donald Trump, and he was somebody that Donald Trump and Joe Biden were looking at to replace the current NATO Secretary General, and it looks like he will now replace the NATO Secretary General as the election's coming closer, even with Estonian objections. I'm getting off topic. Point is, I always thought the right-wing love affair with Viktor Orban didn't make any logical sense, but due to this love affair, we now have some information that I do think is very important. Now, this is something we've suspected for a while, and we've talked about this for a while. So this is not something that completely comes out of left field, but I didn't expect this information to come out during the election. I didn't expect it because I thought Donald Trump would be, well, it would be smart for him to keep his mouth shut about it until after the election. I've suspected for a while that Donald Trump's plan to end the war in 24 hours is simply to cut off all support to Ukraine at the sounding of the bell. And once he cuts off all support for Ukraine, he can then try to force them to accept an unpopular deal that the Russians will then force upon them, since they don't have a base of support in the West. And therefore, he'll be able to bring peace, at least for the time being. Do I think Donald Trump is going to think into the future, like, how do we stop this invasion from happening again? No, you would have to rely on his staff for that. And considering how thorough he's being and trying to pick loyalists this time around, I don't know if anybody would be brave enough to step up and speak up to say, hey, if we don't put something in here, like a unilateral defense pact or NATO membership, something to stop the Russians from invading again, then they might just invade again. In fact, we have good reason to believe they will. But I don't think Trump is prepared to do that. What I do think Trump is prepared to do is something like this. Orban says Trump told him he will not give a penny to Ukraine if elected, which according to Orban will force the war to end, presumably in Russian victory. This is, by the way, I believe chief foreign affairs correspondent for the Wall Street Journal. Let's read Orban's full statement from Pravda. He has a very clear vision that is hard to disagree with. This is in reference to Donald Trump. He says the following first. He will not give a single penny for the Russo-Ukrainian war. That's why the war will end, because it's obvious that Ukraine cannot stand on its own 2 feet. If the Americans don't give money and weapons along with the Europeans, the war will end. And if the Americans don't give money, then the Europeans won't be able to fund this war alone. And then the war will end. So this, to me, makes me very suspicious about why aid has been held up for so long. You know, there's a lot of reasons given. Oh, there had to be a border deal first. It's like, okay, well, let's negotiate for 5 months. Here's the border deal. No, now the border deal is too close to an election, so we can't really have a big border deal. But in order to pass any Ukraine aid, you need to give us border compromises. And you look at this circle that's being formed, which is you need to give us border compromises in order to get Ukraine aid passed, negotiate, give border compromises, too close to an election, sorry, can't do it, can't give border compromises for Ukraine aid, but you have to give border compromises for Ukraine aid. We're restarting the circle. We're going in the circle. And I look at that, and to some conclusion, I'm like, okay, so they've worked themselves into a corner where they wanted to please their base because the 118th Congress has been so unproductive. And you hear congressmen like Chip Roy come forward and say, we haven't gotten anything done. We haven't done anything. And so they need to get some compromises forward. So let's negotiate for 5 months to give them those compromises. But then those compromises are given, and then they say, well, sorry, we can't do that. But by the way, you need to give us compromises in order to pass Ukraine aid. I was of the belief that, well, maybe they just worked themselves into a corner, and then Trump said no, and now they're just stuck. But if Trump's intention is to stop Ukraine aid in order to make the Ukrainians weaker, so the Ukrainians have a harder time fighting the Russians, and therefore might be forced, whether or not they will or won't, if you listen to them, they say they won't, but who knows? Maybe they will be forced to compromise with the Russians. If this is the plan, then it would make sense from a purely cynical, want to force them to negotiate standpoint. Why wait till 2025 to block the aid? To start building this leverage, to start wearing the Ukrainians down? Why not start undermining their war effort, stopping the guns, stopping the aid, and helping the Russians a whole year in advance? So, because if they can stop aid from going to Ukraine from September of 2023, that's when all these negotiations started. Oh my God, the dogs downstairs are yelling. They're as upset about this as I am. If they can stop the Ukraine aid from September of 2023 all the way up to January of 2025 when Trump comes into office, then that's well over a year of aid being blocked in the House. That'll be well over 2 years of aid not getting a vote in the House. And so then Trump gets in there, and then the Ukrainians will be looking down the barrel of months and months and months and possibly years to a whole term of possibly no support from the United States to Ukraine, despite promises made after they gave up their nuclear weapons, despite promises made by the Biden administration, despite promises made by members of both parties, and despite commitments made by Donald Trump himself. Now, all of that will be thrown out in order to increase the leverage to bring them to the negotiating table. Now, there's a bunch of things that I have wrong with this plan. The first thing I have wrong with this plan is, if Trump is art of the deal, Mr. Master Negotiator, then he should be of the basic understanding that if you stop giving the Ukrainians leverage, if you stop sending them artillery shells, artillery guns, tanks, ATACMS, which I heard that if they do approve aid, that will be in the first tranche of aid. If you stop sending them the support that they need, air defense, to defend their country, then the Russians, as they continue to build up their own artillery stockpiles, as they continue to build up their own supplies and continue to get help from the Iranians and the North Koreans, their allies stay with them. We abandon our own allies. We abandon our allies while their allies don't abandon them. All that's going to mean is Ukraine has less and less and less and less leverage. And then we're in two scenarios. The first scenario is the scenario that Trump presumably wants, if this plan is to be believed, which is that the Ukrainians are in such a bad position that Trump can force them to give up Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and all of this other, possibly more, who knows, as well as maybe limiting their army to 85,000 soldiers like the Russians originally demanded, so they wouldn't be able to defend themselves if they were invaded again. Maybe it would be with a guarantee of no NATO membership. So not only would they have a small military, and not only would they be losing all this land, but they would also be losing more leverage into the future, knowing that nobody would come to their assistance if they were invaded again. Who knows what exact plan would be drawn up? We have a general idea of what the Russians wanted at the start of the war due to recent leaks due to the peace band being leaked to the public. We have a general idea of what the Russians are trying to move towards now, but we don't know what Trump would be willing to give up. But even if Trump doesn't want to give up that much, if the Ukrainians don't have the leverage, it's not as simple as snap your fingers, now they have all the leverage. It takes time to send them equipment. It takes time for them to train on the equipment. It takes time for them to get the equipment to the front. And so if he blocks it for a year and a half, then we could really put the Ukrainians in the position, and this is the scenario that he wants, where they have to negotiate and give up all this stuff. And so that's the best case scenario, which, by the way, doesn't guarantee peace. It could mean, because we've had over 200 rounds of negotiations pre-2022 invasion and 20 negotiated ceasefires that have failed, that this is just negotiated ceasefire number 21. Then it fails, and now with the Ukrainians with a smaller army, now with the Ukrainians with less land, with less population, with less taxable income, with less agricultural products to be able to profit from and support the state, they then have to defend against another Russian invasion that will not be making the same mistakes as last time. So you have to, presumably, trust the Russians to not do that. Again, this is very difficult to speculate on because we don't know what type of deal Trump would end up accepting.